Chapter 16, Free to Go. The answers began with a Supreme Court ruling that December in the case called Ex parte Endo. It was the last of three key cases heard since the camps had opened. In the first, Gordon Hirabayashi, a Nisei student from the University of Washington, challenged the evacuation order. He had also violated the Army's curfew imposed early in 1942 on all West Coast Japanese. He challenged the racial bias of these actions and the abuse of his civil rights. The court avoided the issue of the evacuation itself by ruling on the curfew. It upended the Army's decision to limit the movements of a racially select group of citizens. The reasoning? Wartime necessity. In the second case, the issue was the exclusion orders that removed us from our homes and sent us inland. Fred Korematsu, a young Nisei living in Oakland, had ignored the evacuation to stay with his Caucasian girlfriend. He had plastic surgery done on his face, he changed his name, and was posing as a Spanish Hawaiian when the FBI caught up with him. In court, the racial bias was challenged again. Why were no German Americans evacuated, it was asked, or Americans of Italian descent? Weren't these nations our enemies too? Due process had been violated, and Korematsu challenged along with other constitutional rights. But the Army's decision to evacuate was also upheld by the Supreme Court. The final case challenged the internment itself. Soon after she was evacuated in 1942, Mitsu Endo, a 21-year-old Nisei and an employee of the California State Highway Commission, had filed a petition for habeas corpus, protesting her detention at Topaz Camp in central Utah. She spent 2.5 years waiting the High Court's decision, which was that she had been right. The government cannot detain loyal citizens against their will. Anticipating this ruling, the Army's Western Defense Command had already announced that the mass exclusion orders of 1942 were being rescinded. Next, it was announced that all the camps would be closed within the coming 12 months, and that internees now had the right to return to their former homes. In our family, the response to this news was hardly joyful. For one thing, we had no home to return to. Worse, the very thought of going back to the West Coast filled us with dread. What will they think of us, those who sent us here? How will they look at us? 3 years of wartime propaganda, racist headlines, atrocity movies, hate slogans, and fright mask posters had turned the Japanese face into something despicable and grotesque. Mama and Papa knew this. They had been reading the papers. Even I knew, although it was not until many years later that I realized how bad things actually were. In addition to the traditionally racist organizations like the American Legion and the Native Sons of the Golden West, who had been agitating against the West Coast Japanese for decades, new groups had sprung up during the war, with the specific purpose of preventing anyone of Japanese descent from returning to the coast. Groups like No Japs Incorporated in San Diego, the Homefront Commandos in Sacramento, and the Pacific Coast Japanese Problem League in Los Angeles. Also, some growers' associations threatened by the return of interned farmers had been using the war as a way to foment hostile feelings in the major farming areas. What's more, our years of isolation at Manzanar had widened the already spacious gap between the races, and it is not hard to understand why so many preferred to stay where they were. Before the war, one of the standard charges made against the Japanese was their clannishness, their standoffishness, their refusal to assimilate. The camps had made this reality in the extreme. After 3 years in our desert ghetto, at least we knew where we stood with our neighbors. One could live more or less at ease with them. Yet the government was saying we not only were free to go, like the move out of Terminal Island and the move to Owens Valley, we had to go. Definite dates were being fixed for the closing of the camp. By January of 45, a few determined internees were already trying to recover former homes and farmlands. Ominous reports at their reception began trickling back to confirm our deepest fears. A Nisei man had been assaulted on the street in Seattle. A home was burned in San Jose. Night riders carrying shotguns had opened fire on a farmhouse near Fresno, narrowly missing 2 sleeping children. Later on in May, one of my sisters and her husband, leaving for the east, were escorted to the Southern Pacific Depot in Los Angeles by armed guards, not because they were thought to be dangerous, but for their own protection. Most of the Japanese returning to the coast resettled without severe bodily harm, but gossip tends to thrive on bad news, not good. Stories such as these spread through the camp and grew in our minds like tumors. I remember hearing them discussed in our barracks quietly, as if Ku Klux Klansmen lurked outside the window, the same way our brothers discussed our dilemma during the brief stay in Boyle Heights before the evacuation. I would listen to the stories and I would cringe. And this was both odd and confusing to me because ever since we'd arrived, the outside world had loomed in my imagination as someplace inaccessible, yet wonderfully desirable. I would recall our days in Ocean Park. I would flip through the Sears Roebuck catalog, dream of the dresses and boots and coats that were out there somewhere on the other end of the highway beyond the gate. All the truly good things, it often seemed, the things we couldn't get, were outside and had to be sent for or shipped in. In this sense, God and Sears Roebuck catalog were pretty much one and the same in my young mind. During a novena at the Maryknoll chapter, I had asked for something I desperately longed for and had never seen inside the camp. We were told to ask for something we really wanted. We were to write it on a piece of paper, pray devoutly for 9 days, and if we prayed well, it would be answered. The nuns expected us to ask for purity of soul or a holy life. I asked God for some dried apricots. I wrote this on a piece of paper, dropped it into the prayer box, and began to fantasize about how they would arrive in a package from Sears Roebuck. I knew how they would taste and the feel in my hands. I said my rosary 30 times a day for 9 days, and for 9 more days after that I waited. The dried apricots never came. My faith in God and in the Catholic Church slipped several notches at that time. Not my faith in the outside, which all such good things could be found. I went back to flipping through the catalog. Those images, of course, had come from my past. What I had to face now, a year later, was the future. I was old enough to imagine it and was old enough to fear it. The physical violence didn't trouble me. Somehow I didn't quite believe that, or didn't want to believe such things could happen to us. It was the humiliation. That continuous, unnamed ache I had been living with was precise and definable now. Call it the foretaste of being hated. I knew ahead of time that if someone looked at me with hate, I would have to allow it, to swallow it, because something in me, something about me deserved it. At 10, I saw that coming, like a judge's sentence, and I would have stayed inside the camp forever, rather than step outside and face such a moment. I shared this particular paralysis with Mama and Papa, but not with my older brothers and sisters. The hostility worried them, but their desire to be rid of Manzanar outweighed that worry. They were in their 20s and had their lives to lead. They decided to take a chance on the East Coast. It was 3,000 miles away with no history of anti-Asianism, in fact, no Asian history at all. So few people of Asian ancestry had settled there, it was like heading for a neutral country. Bill was the first to make that move, with Tommy and their baby boy. He had lined up a job with Seabrook Farms in New Jersey, a new frozen food enterprise that offered work to many Nisei at the end of the war. A few weeks later, Frances and her husband joined them, followed by Martha and Kaz, then Lillian, who had just finished her junior year in high school, and Ray. As each cluster of relatives departed, we'd say, "See you in New Jersey. Find us all a big house back there." What we told each other was that Bill and Frances and the others would go on ahead, make sure things would be worked out, and they'd send for the rest of us. "See you in New Jersey," as we would wave as the bus pulled out, taking someone else to the train station in L.A. But they all knew, even as they said it, that Papa would never move back east. As bad as the West Coast sounded, it was still his home territory. He was too old to start over, too afraid of rejection in the unknown part of the world, too stubborn and too tired to travel that far, and finally too proud to do piecework on an assembly line. Like so many Issei, he had, for better or worse, run his own businesses, been his own man for too long to tolerate the idea of working for someone else. The truth was, at this point, Papa did not know which way to turn. In the government's eyes, a free man now, he sat like those black slaves you hear about who, when they got word of their freedom at the end of the Civil War, just did not know where else to